Hello, and welcome to episode 11 of Track Records podcast with your hosts, Kenny and Barry. We're here to talk about all things music. And I had an interesting thought for today, Barry, unless you had something on your mind, which was I was thinking about the Beatles. I'm sure you've heard of them. And the fact that and I'm a Beatles fan, although certainly not, they're not my favorite band of all time. But I think what they did was the most important thing, like basically in the history of rock and roll. It's sort of like the Jackie Robinson breaking the color line in baseball, which is once they started writing their own songs, that just changed the landscape for everyone. Because bands really weren't doing that beforehand for the most part. And so like someone like Elvis, who was hugely popular, but never wrote any of his songs, or if he did, it was just a very small handful later on. And when they did that, then that meant the Stones had to write their songs, and the Who couldn't just keep doing, blues covers. They had to write their songs, and Zeppelin and so forth. And I think if they hadn't done that, I guess organically it would have happened at some point. But it's just interesting. It got to the point where it was almost embarrassing for an artist if they didn't write their own songs. Hence the whole thing with the Monkees.
So first, just a snarky comment.
Yeah.
Zeppelin was still doing blues songs, but calling them their own songs for
Yes.
starters. um, yeah, I think you're spot on, and I would be curious to see what you think about whether or not it was something that was a concerted effort, like we have to start writing songs, or we don't have a very long career in this business, or if it just happened organically, because some of the bands you mentioned, Stones, The Who, starting off with the Beatles or the Kinks for that matter, right? They all started off by playing covers, and all those early records
Yeah.
are populated with probably 80% covers and maybe 20% originals. So do you think it was a matter of, we have to do this, or did it just happen because they were becoming mature as musicians, and it just was a natural progression into writing their own songs, and they in fact wanted to do that from the get-go, but they just didn't have the tools in their toolbox to do so.
And I think that with the Beatles, from everything I've read, like the friendship that John and Paul formed was one based on songwriting. And so I think they were eventually going to write their own songs, or really at least try, if nothing
Mhm.
else. Whereas I feel like the Stones and the Who and all felt like the pressure of, look, we can't keep doing covers if they're not doing covers. So I think it was
Mhm.
different. I think that that's why it was so seismic, what the Beatles did in that regard. And it's interesting. John talks about when he met Paul. John had his band, the Quarrymen, at that point, and John was the leader of the band, and John liked being the leader of the band, and he knew if he took Paul into the band, he was not going to be the leader anymore, that it was going to be a shared, element. And he had to decide, did he want a better band, but sharing the leadership, or did he want to just have his own band, which wouldn't be as good without Paul? And so it's interesting that making that choice. Um, but they started off as songwriting partners, and then actually it became a sort of competition where John
Yeah,
would write a song and then Paul would say, okay, I've got to top that. And then he'd do it. And then John would try to top him and so forth. Um,
yeah, that's always been well documented, that their their songwriting partnership somewhat fractured as they became older and more experienced, and probably had more of a singular voice as they got a little older. It's funny to think, oh yeah, when the Beatles were older, they still weren't even fucking pushing 30,
yes.
you know,
But Paul
by the
talks
time they
about that.
broke up. Or
Paul talks about, he says, like he talked about when he was 25 or 26, he talked about wanting to keep doing music until he was a white-haired old man. He said not doing stuff like She Loves You, but doing more mature music. And he even talked then about writing film scores and stuff like that. So it's interesting that he could see down the road. Whereas, like, I remember also when they talked to Ringo, as opposed to Ringo was like, this will last for a couple of years. We'll make some money, and then it'll fade. And that's when he talked about opening his chain of hairdressing salons with whatever money he'd make. So it's interesting that Paul had that vision of, okay, it may not be the Beatles, but I will be writing music. I'll be doing music. And I don't think a lot of artists thought that.
yeah, I think you're probably right, and I do think, like so many things the Beatles did, they laid the groundwork for all these other bands to follow. Whether it was the Who, the Kinks, the Stones, those are the main ones, and then
Yep.
there's other bands like, the Hollies, the Moody Blues.
Yep.
They all jumped on the bandwagon, and yeah, it was, I suppose, the Beatles who started including more originals, and then the others followed along. And obviously it worked out well for all of them and us too as music fans. um, if they'd kept down that same path of just doing, the Stones doing Chuck Berry covers, or the Who doing the odd James Brown cover like on their very first record, um, we would not, rock music would not be what it is today.
That's
So
my
thank
point.
God they started, all
They're
those English boys started writing their own songs and putting
it's
out these amazing records.
it's really interesting because between them and actually I should also mention the Beach Boys with
Oh,
Brian
for sure.
Wilson. Yeah, but
For
if it wasn't
sure.
because they were at the same time, but if it wasn't for that, if it wasn't for Brian Wilson and Lennon and McCartney, there'd be no Monterey Pop Festival. There'd be no Woodstock. Obviously, there would still be popular music, but we wouldn't have rock and roll that we have today. It's really interesting.
Thank God for all the English bands from that era, because I mean, let's face it, 90% of them were from this small little country
Yeah,
that gets lots of rain. And it was just like lightning in a bottle that happened at that time in such a small little concentrated area of the world. And thank God it did, because everything has sort of, as far as rock music goes, bloomed from there. That said, a lot of that came from Chuck Berry, though,
yeah.
and Ray Charles and James Brown. Even, the Stones, Mick Jagger aped all of James Brown's move. You go back and watch some old footage, it's like, oh, there's the white English James Brown, this little skinny guy with big lips dancing exactly like James Brown.
No
Not as
question.
good though.
Yes, but yeah, and certainly Muddy Waters, Lightning Hopkins, Howling Wolf, they certainly had a big influence as well. So yeah, so you can trace it back to the 30s, 40s, 50s of rock in the U.S. or not rock, but blues in the U.S. But it is interesting how that stuff was popular, but to a more limited audience, partially for racial reasons. But then when as you point out, it's such a small country and such in a such short period of time, the Kinks, the Who, the Stones, the Beatles, even then other bands like the Animals,
Uh-huh.
or even just even like limited contributions from bands like
Pretty
Jerry and the
things.
Pacemakers, uh
Yeah.
you know
Yeah, Jerry and the
Freddie and the
Pacemakers.
Drummers, uh and so
Okay,
that
now you're pushing
oh
it,
well,
pal.
I'm a sucker for British invasion. Cream.
Hmm.
Okay,
Hmm. Which
Traffic.
was,
Yeah.
even though now it seems like that was relatively the same time, Cream was even just a tad later, or the
It was.
Yardbirds.
Yeah, the Yardbirds
But
was that
yeah,
time. Yeah,
yeah, when you think back on it, it's astonishing. Has there ever been a more fertile period of rock music that came out in one little area, relatively little, in such a short amount of time? I guess maybe you might consider, San Francisco in the mid 60s, maybe, but still doesn't
yeah,
compare.
yeah. San Francisco in the mid '60s, 67 in particular. New York in the the late '70s or mid to late
For
'70s with
sure.
the punk and new wave movement and all, but not to the extent of what happened in England from '64 to '67. And obviously it went on after '67, but that 3 years of just the explosion of rock and roll. It's
And
just
we'll never, it's unlikely history will ever see something like that again.
I'd be stunned. I mean, stunned. And also because of the difference, once they started writing their own songs, these bands, and started really caring about the albums they were putting out and taking control of their own careers, then you were waiting for that next album to come out, as opposed to when the albums were coming out every 6 months that were half filler or more. I don't think there was that pent up demand as opposed to, when the Stones did, Beggar's Banquet, and you're like, okay, man, that was unbelievable. What's next? and just this desire to see what was next. And that's also where, it's the Stones. I'm a bigger Stones fan than I am a Beatles fan, but if it wasn't for the Beatles trying, psychedelic music, the Stones wouldn't have. If it wasn't for the Beatles trying country music, the Stones wouldn't have. You just get to feel that where the Beatles led, the Stones and other bands followed.
Yeah, going back to what we were originally pointing out, yeah, they laid the groundwork for sure. In in all respects, whether it was growing your hair long,
Yeah,
superficial things like that,
yeah.
or
No, it made a difference.
perhaps, no longer wearing suits while you're playing,
Yeah,
um, all that stuff. And of course, most importantly, it was the musical trends, like you mentioned. That record the Stones put out right after Sergeant Pepper, their Satanic Majesties, which gets universally panned, but that's a damn good record. In fact, I listen to that way more than I listen to Sergeant Pepper these days.
and,
It's way
and
better, in my opinion.
yeah, and I feel the exact same way. I think I don't know if we're outliers, but certainly the majority of opinion is the reverse. But I don't really care. John Lennon himself was not a fan of Sgt. Pepper's. And just like I was making the Jackie Robinson analogy earlier, it's sort of like Jackie Robinson was not the best African American player in the history of baseball. He wasn't even the best African American player then. But if there hadn't been a Jackie Robinson, baseball wouldn't have become what it's become.
Yeah.
And so if there hadn't been a Beatles, I guess it's sort of interesting, like the Marvel What If comics.
Hmm.
What if there hadn't been a Beatles? you know, because the Beatles writing their own songs, the Stones manager Andrew Luke Oldham pushed Keith and Mick to write their own songs. Brian was happy just doing blues, Brian Jones, and so it's interesting that if there hadn't been a Beatles, what would have happened? It'd be cool if like to be able to see that somehow.
Yeah, maybe there is some alternate universe out
Right.
there where that's going on that we're not privy to. It seems like there's still, because of things like Elvis obviously influenced a lot of those early English bands too. But again, Elvis was basically doing what Chuck Berry was doing, except he was white and really handsome. And I don't think any black performer at that time would have gotten the same recognition
No,
as an Elvis,
no.
for the obvious reasons. Um, but going back to locales and timing. So I wonder if people who are quite a bit younger than us, say who became of age in their teenage years in the early 90s, I wonder if they look upon a place like Seattle as being as seismic as London or England in the mid 60s is to us, meaning that's their ground zero for where it all started for them because of the obvious bands, Pearl Jam, Nirvana, Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, Sushi Robo, all those bands. Um, so you know, when we look at it, clearly it doesn't have the same impact. But with somebody who say is 40 now, would they look at that as like a more important time, even though it all stemmed from what happened in the 60s? Is it more important to them simply because of their age? And it's what was,
It,
uh, really important to everybody who was into rock music at that time.
and it was. I think it's somewhat still, in just in my opinion, partly because I'm not as much of a fan of that realm of music, but as opposed to the punk movement, where not only was it some great music, okay, but it really shook up a very morbid industry.
Hmm.
70s rock had become very bloated and arena rock, and I think punk rock was important just for sort of like, let's take the record player, let's take the needle, scratch it, like let's put it back at the beginning, let's get rid of this crap that's going on right now, and let's start over. And that's where, when we were talking about the Ramones before, I think they were critically important, more even than musically important, in terms of the change that they affected, and the Talking Heads and the Clash and the Pistols. And so, whereas I don't feel that way personally about Pearl Jam, Alice in Chains, Screaming Trees. So
But to your point, the entire music industry. So say that, let's just call 1990 as the year where
Sure.
that all broke.
Yep.
It's, right around then, between the punk explosion of the late 70s, early 80s, rock music had once again become super stale, super corporate,
Yep.
with the proliferation of all those shitty hair metal bands. That
Yep.
that's
Yep.
what was the biggest thing at that point, say mid 80s to late 80s. That was all over MTV. It was all over the airwaves. And so I think a lot of people look at, and I hate to use this term, but the grunge explosion
Yep.
as as it, shooting all that down, tearing all that down, and starting again using a punk rock ethos
Yep.
um, to tear all that down, which it successfully did. It became the mainstream shortly thereafter when Pearl Jam and Nirvana broke, and I mean those were the biggest bands in the world, and you couldn't find a band like Cinderella or
Rat.
Warrant or
Yeah.
Motley Crue,
Yeah. Yeah.
all that shit.
Yeah.
Nobody's ever going to remember any of that, 20, 30 years down the road. So it's
No, that's a good
interesting to
point.
see how
Yep.
these things have come and gone, these explosions. For anyone who is interested in popular music, all that stuff's pretty critical and pretty important. Um, so,
No, I
all
think that's
right,
a good
take
point.
it easy.
I think it is interesting that it's often a reaction to something else before it. Just something else
And,
going on, because you had the blues, then you had Elvis, and then also Dylan came along around the same time as the Beatles,
sure.
and so that was a sort of two track. But then you had the mid 60s, and then the late 60s as music started getting very, very heavy, and then as an answer to that, the early 70s was singer songwriter, so they
And
went from heavy
also
to
at
down
the
to
same,
soft. Yeah.
and also that's when there was a ton of squirrely prog rock bands that were very popular, and there were bands, and again this punk was a big pushback to this, bands like Yes or ELP,
Yeah.
these bands who were playing these 14-minute epics that basically started boring people.
Yeah.
They I guess you could call some of that prog stuff, which I happen to like, by the way, as somewhat navel gazing
And
music.
yeah, ELP, another one. Yeah, and I think it definitely was a reaction to that sort of thing. And it's also interesting that at the same time as the prog rock and singer songwriter sort of occupying almost a middle ground between the two was glam.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah,
with T Rex and Bowie and Slade, Mott the Hoople, bands like that.
sweet.
Sweet, the as they were known back then, the Sweet. Um,
I picked up we were down in St. Louis when my friends were here, and I picked up a Sweet record that I did not have. Remember that song, Love is Like Oxygen?
yeah, that was towards their
That's
end. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, that
I
was
like that as
their
well.
last gasp.
I'm a sucker for Sweet. Their best album is Destination Boulevard,
Mhm.
but I did like Love Is Like Oxygen. And it was funny how they
If you get
started.
too much, you get too high.
Yes,
That's
it, it,
crucial lyric.
that was their last hit, and it was funny because their first one was Little Willie, which I don't think
Mhm.
anyone ever thinks of Sweet as having done that song, but that was their intro into.
That's how they originally got on my radar. Do you remember those? I'm sure you do because we're around the same age. In
I know
the
what you're going
early
to say.
70s,
Yeah.
Those KTEL
I knew. Yep,
compilations.
I knew exactly where you're
So
going. Yeah.
that's how I was introduced to music, because my mom had a bunch of those.
Yeah.
And that, in fact, that's what opened my eyes and ears to music, was sitting in our living room, listening to my mom's KTEL compilations. She wasn't obviously like a serious record collector or anything, but she liked music. She was really into Elvis as a young girl. And anyway, so she probably had a half a dozen of those. And if you look at those today, because I still have a bunch of those,
Yeah.
they're great compilations of that early to mid 70s when popular music, top 40 music was so good. And Little Willie by Sweet was one of those. And even more importantly for me was Crocodile Rock by Elton John.
That was
And then I
definitely one of
was
them.
off and running as
Yeah.
a music fanatic because of that.
And I remember one of the KTEL records I had Thin Lizzy, The Boys Are Back in Town,
Sure,
and that's how I was
sure.
introduced to that. And and then it's interesting though with punk, that almost a reaction to punk was disco, which is
Um, so you're saying that that punk was first and then disco, or what are you saying?
yeah. I'm saying punk was first and then disco. The timelines get a little fuzzy. It depends on where you feel punk began, where you feel disco began. And,
I
and
I see those as at the same time, almost exactly the same time, and completely separate. I don't see those as one being a pushback to the other. I really see those as concurrent.
the only reason I would say that about disco is I think that there was and there was definitely like a racial difference. Like, certainly when disco first, hit, it was much more of an African American music,
And
and
also
punk
a gay thing,
and gay.
the
Yep,
gay discos in New York.
absolutely. And whereas
That's
punk
where it
was
really
was
started.
much more of a white boys on dope, music. But
Working class
yeah,
English yabos.
but I think that I think that there were some people given the choice, like some people were like, yeah, I want to gob, I want to slam dance, give me the Clash, give me the Pistols, and other people were like, why would you want to do that? I just want to dance the night away, give me
I want to
Donna Summer.
dance,
Yeah,
do a bunch of coke and get laid.
exactly. Like Hello Studio 54, you know. Yeah,
Going back to your comment
yeah,
about glam being one of those genres, um, I'd be curious to see what you think as far as what are some of these genres or periods that we're talking about, which ones have held up best. And I gotta say, musically, I think glam is right up there. If you're calling glam, if you're calling people like Bowie, Mark Bolan, Sweet, some of these so-called glam bands, I think their music, not necessarily the styles and all that nonsense, but the music holds up as well as any genre. That's kind of a subgenre, I guess.
yeah. It's interesting. But yeah, the look has not held up, but the sound certainly has. And that's also the tricky thing. Like, when I look at bands, when we're discussing bands, like the Stones, for example, where like Sticky Fingers is a fantastic album. I can't listen to it anymore.
Really?
I've just heard it way too many times, way too many times. And there are
So
certain records I can keep listening to. Zoso is another one I can't listen to anymore. I've just heard it too much. Whereas other records, even records I've played a lot, the Waterboys, Fisherman Blues, is a record I've played 1,000 times, and I still will listen to all the time. Interesting thing about that, by the way, is I think that their albums before it were complete crap, and except for the album right after it, the rest of the albums after it weren't any good. They just nailed it for that one particular record, and it's one of my top 20 records of all time. But are there albums that you think are great albums that you own that you just I can't listen to that anymore?
yeah, a lot of the ones you mentioned, and it's not that I can't listen to them. It's
Yeah,
just when I go down to the record room, I'm not picking out Led Zeppelin 4
yeah,
or to circle back to one you mentioned earlier, Sergeant Pepper or
yeah,
Sergeant Pepper's. And I didn't mean to insinuate that it's not a great record, because obviously it is.
yeah,
It's just that it's one of those for me that listening to it now, it goes through me
yeah,
because I know it like the back of my hand.
right.
And some of those other ones you mentioned too, but Sticky Fingers isn't one of them. I find new things to mine out of it. Records like that, I can still listen to and will still pull out occasionally and still be moved by it. Exile on Main Street, that run of Stones records, all of those fall into that category for me. They just still to this day still move me.
And again, I'm not knocking the records. I think they're fantastic, and I do think they're some of the best rock records of all time. Okay, it's just that certain ones I can still listen to. I can still listen to Beggar's Banquet. I just can't listen to Sticky Fingers anymore. I have Dark Side of the Moon. I was never the biggest Pink Floyd fan anyway, but that album I definitely can't listen to. As opposed to
Really?
I can listen to Wish You Were Here and enjoy
Uh-huh.
it still.
Uh-huh.
So they're just certain records. Or and sometimes I come back to it. And so like for a long time I couldn't listen to Disraeli Gears by Cream.
Hmm.
And now I could. It's been long enough that I haven't heard any of that. I can do without ever hearing Sunshine of Your Love again. But other than
Mhm.
that, the rest of the songs in the album are real good and I can listen to it again. But there's definitely stuff
Um,
like I never need to hear Frampton Comes Alive ever again in my life. Um,
um, going back to where we left off our last segment,
yeah.
we had just started talking about uh, band or bands or artists we listen to when we're feeling a particular in a particular mood, and
Mhm.
I'd mentioned Joy Division. Um, and I wanted to circle back to that topic because I'm curious to see who your go-tos are. So just to reiterate, whenever it seemed like anytime I was depressed over like a failing relationship or whatever, something just not working out, and it would depress me. I would, for some reason, always go to Joy Division, who are still in my top 5 bands all time, even though they only released 2 proper records. Um, but that's a band I've listened to those records, hundreds, if not thousands of times. And I can still get goosebumps listening to certain songs on those records. And I don't know what it is, because the music is pretty morose and pretty down. But when I'm feeling that way, when I listen to it, it makes me feel better, if that makes any sense at all.
Yeah, I could see that. And I'm a big Joy Division fan. And they're definitely, though, I've got to be in the right mood to listen to them.
Hmm.
It's funny because I'm much more of an upbeat like music. I prefer more upbeat, infectious, music. Hence my
Hmm.
love for bubblegum. But I can definitely get in my Joy Division mood and listen to that sort of stuff. And it's funny because there's when Julie and I split up and I was living in New York, I would actually go down to the corner bar and the great chicken fingers, and I'd eat chicken fingers and I'd do shots of Jack Daniels, and I would play "Up the Junction" by
So
Squeeze.
what's changed? I'm
Yes,
sorry.
nothing's changed, except that she and I aren't together. But I would play "Up the Junction" by Squeeze over and
uh,
over. And so when I think of our relationship in our past, I key in on that, you know.
which is
And
interesting because that's like the polar opposite of my go-to.
in
So
Go ahead.
just so I understand,
Yep.
you're saying you would listen to that when you guys were having problems
No,
and
I
you were
listened to that
drinking.
after we split up.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
Okay,
Gotcha. But
it's a
still,
song.
you're reeling from that. Is
Yeah.
that right?
Yep.
Okay.
And it's a song about a couple breaking up.
Gotcha.
Although "Up the Junction" is British term for fucked. And it was interesting just hearing that. I don't know, like almost like I was teaching myself a lesson or something like that, but hearing that really it helped. As opposed to another relationship where I wanted to hang on to it, but for long reasons I'm not going to go into, we couldn't make it last. But sitting in the at the Rat in Boston, listening to "I Held Her in My Arms" by the Bond Films, and that
Mhm.
was and just something about that song playing and being with her. And so whenever I hear that song, there are just certain songs that put me back to a certain place in time. And it's funny because in High Fidelity, he talks about reorganizing his mammoth record collection, not alphabetically, but biographically. And
Yeah,
so,
I remember that.
yeah, and so it's sort of interesting because there are certain songs that just they put me in a certain time and place. What you're talking about with Joy Division is more of a general mood, which I get as well. But are there certain songs that put you, like that remind you of a certain point of your life?
Uh, yeah, it's really just all of those 2 records of theirs, and actually some that showed up on some of those compilations after Ian Curtis died. Um, there's not particular songs per se. I don't know, maybe
I don't mean Joy
like
Division. I just mean in general.
Oh, in general. Uh, let me think off the top of my head. Yeah, and this this piggybacks on a topic that we may touch on later on down the road, but songs you really like by artists you don't necessarily like.
Yeah.
Um, one of those songs for me is, and I'm pretty sure it's about a dissolving relationship, and I don't really like much of anything else this guy did, but the song "In the Air Tonight" by
Oh
Phil
yeah.
Collins
Yep.
um, is such. I find that to be so moving and just almost a perfect song. The dynamics of it, and again, I'm not a big Phil Collins guy, but man, he sure nails it on that song, and you feel his pain just by that vocal. And again, I have to go back to the arrangement and the music and the dynamics of it. That would be one that if I was feeling particularly shitty about a relationship, typically it's a relationship that when I start getting depressed, a relationship that's not working, that song just like sums it all up for me.
Yeah, and that's what I'm talking about. It's interesting. Another like similar song for me by an artist I'm not a huge fan of either. Paul Young's "Come Back and Stay." You know,
Okay, we're done, pal.
I'm telling you, go ahead and give it a listen. You must have the album
Paul
somewhere.
Young.
Yep, just that
Okay,
one song.
yeah,
I told you I like "Him" by Rupert Holmes. Okay,
I
uh,
know, I know, and I'm
I
breaking
like
your balls, of course.
I'm fine with that. I like "It's My Life" by Bon Jovi. There's one song
Ooh,
I like by
ooh,
there's one song I like by various artists and bands who I otherwise hate. Um,
Bon
except
Jovi though.
just that one song.
Oh,
Yep.
wow,
So
wow. I'm
these are not things
surprised.
I listen to a lot, but that's again one of the great things about streaming because I would never buy a record, never.
Mhm.
Okay,
At
that
least you wouldn't tell anybody you
yeah,
did.
exactly. I'd have them hidden like in the downstairs vault. But that is one of the great things about streaming because all those artists I mentioned, I wouldn't buy any of their records. But I could, but if I feel like hearing, that Rupert Holmes song, I can listen to it whenever I want, so no,
Him. It's that song,
yeah,
right?
it's that one. Yep. Yeah. Uh, I
That's
know who
funny.
left those smokes behind. Not my brand. You understand. Sometimes the girl forgets. She
Ah,
forgets to
that's
hide them. So, yep.
yeah. I
So,
I, I
and it's funny because
understand.
as much as I like that song, I can't stand the Pina Colada song. I hate it. I pretty much hate everything else he ever did. Um,
Mhm.
and then there are artists where, like someone like Jimmy Buffett, I don't like anything. I just
Sure.
can't listen to Jimmy Buffett. I don't get it. I just,
Bon Jovi is that's my band for that sort of thing. Like I can't stand one note of their shit. It's
and
just
for
the
the most part, I feel the
worst
exact same way.
crap
Like I said, there's
ever.
something about that
Ugh.
one song that I'm okay with, but they're not good. Um, in those bands we mentioned earlier, Cinderella, Rat, Poison, Whitesnake, like there's not,
Motley Crue.
yeah, like Twisted Sister, all those bands. And what really annoyed me, like bands like Motley Crue or Twisted Sister, is when they started doing Slade covers and people thinking they're originals. I was like,
Yeah.
get
Quiet
out,
Riot was the big band for that,
yeah,
and they had
and so
huge hits. So, um, okay, you just mentioned a category or a group of bands that fall into one category.
yeah,
And one of the things we've talked about in the past is being, as we get older, being a little more open-minded about some of the artists or bands that we're now more receptive to that we wouldn't have been, say, when we were 17. That's one genre, that hair metal genre. There's no matter how open-minded I am, that all that stuff just sounds like pure shit to me. Still to this day, all of it.
yeah. There's nothing I like, and then I'm going to name a band which you probably like that in my mind I associated with them. It's not the same. Okay, don't get me wrong, it's not the
Mhm.
same, but I just lumped in with them because I never liked Van Halen.
Really?
Yep.
Even those first few records with David Lee Roth, you don't like any of that stuff.
No, like, and I could hear the occasional song, but no, and I never had any of their records. And as they went on, in my mind, they got worse and worse. As they got more popular, and I heard them more often. I disliked them more and more. And
Wow.
so, as opposed to I did like Aerosmith.
Mhm.
And so,
Until
yeah, yeah,
until they
yeah,
got back together.
yeah. No, they're terrible. And as a matter of fact, they've probably released more bad albums than good albums.
For sure, because
You know,
they released 5 good records,
yeah,
like really stone cold rock and roll classics.
yeah. And so it's interesting, like yeah, Clip Your Wings and
Get your wings.
Get Your Wings, and Toys in the
You
Attic.
should know that. You're from Boston, pal.
Yes, well, Toys in the Attic, one of my favorite albums.
For sure.
And so and it's and like there were America's Rolling Stones at one point, in terms
Mhm.
of Joe Perry and Steve Tyler being like Mick and Keith.
They
But
even kind of looked like them,
yeah.
which is so uncanny. I mean, Steven Tyler especially looks a lot like Mick Jagger.
And he used that to his advantage. I mean, like he would
Sure.
dress the same way. He slink around the microphone the same way and all. He definitely went for broke when it came to trying to woo Stones fans. Um,
So
and yeah,
I wouldn't put the Van Halen or um, Aerosmith in that same category as those shitty hair metal bands.
yeah,
Those bands were all a bit later, and also they came of age and were really hoisted upon us because of MTV. Um, I guess that would have been, mid to late 80s. That
and
crap was all over MTV.
the interesting thing about MTV is before MTV, when I could catch an occasional music video, it was so exciting to see a music video. I remember seeing like this crappy Elvis Costello music video, and I was so excited like to just see a music video.
Or
And I
Pump It
love
Up.
and yeah, and anytime I could get anything like that, I would definitely watch it. And then when MTV came out, like within a year, I was like, okay, I'm done with this. Except for the occasional one, something like uh, Dire Straits, Money for Nothing, were a particularly clever video, but for the most part, like for every one good video, like the other nine were terrible or just
Mm-hmm.
annoying. And so it went from being this thing I really loved to this thing I hated. And I blame MTV for that.
Yeah, it changed the landscape for sure.
Because pretty soon you had to do videos. You had to,
Yeah,
much like writing your own
it's
songs, like we started talking about at the beginning. Suddenly you had to do videos.
the whole industry and music in general. I mean, way earlier than MTV was very corporatized and everything was very corporate, but that really pushed it over the edge. Whereas, before then, bands were still dealing with label heads and the money people, but they still seem to have some amount of creative freedom where it wasn't all just about putting out product that the corporate heads could sell and market and make money from. But once MTV hit, that just changed everything for the worse, you know.
Yeah, it's
Um,
interesting. It's sort of like when Jaws came out. After they always used to talk about Jaws as that's the defining line. Where after that they started making movies for money.
Instead of the art.
Yeah, and MTV, ironically enough, started off as more of a sort of rebel type thing, I mean,
Mhm.
and then quickly became mainstream. But it's
Yeah,
funny because
so quickly.
they almost didn't lift off, and they started out like a sort of pirate radio, and so to see what they started at and then became, it's crazy.
And to your point about the early days of that and how music videos were so novel and there wasn't really an easy way to watch them. So when you would see one, like the Pump It Up video you were talking
Yeah,
about, it was really cool. There were certain TV show or TV channels, early cable channels that would play videos. USA Network being one of them
yep,
on this late night weekend show called Night Flight. Like you would see um, Games Without Frontiers, the Peter Gabriel video, or Making Plans for Nigel
yep,
by XTC, or Satisfaction, the